first memory?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should say I sometimes tell people that I was born in church on Sunday morning because my dad was filling in as a pastor, an interim pastor, for someone who was away, and the parsonage was in the church building. It was in a little town in southwestern Minnesota. So that's where we were when I was born. My dad pastored in a number of different places in Minnesota for a while. My earliest memories, I have two very strong memories from before the time I was 2 years old. One of them is my dad skinning a goat. And I think I remember that because it was somewhat traumatic. I don't remember it as being traumatic, but I think that's the reason I remember it. Going outside from whatever house we were in, and the goat was hanging up in a shed, and he was probably taking off the hide in preparation for butchering the goat, and I remember that very, very vividly. The other was when I was in my grandpa's house. This was my mother's father, his house, her mother and father's house, and my great grandpa was there. He was blind, big, tall man, wore dark glasses, and we didn't have any running water or anything like that in the house. The water that we would use would come from an outdoor well, and we needed water. And I asked my great grandpa about going out to get water. He was a very strong man, and my mother said to me, "Don't you think you should go and get water for great grandpa?" And of course, she was just kidding. She was teasing me. But I took it very seriously. And I felt so bad that I couldn't go get water for my great grandpa. So those are my earliest memories. So I'm sure it was before. I know it was before I was 2 years old, because let's see now. It would have been I was almost 3 when we moved to Brooklyn. So it was. I'm sure it was when I was 2 that those things happened. By the time I was 3, my dad had become a pastor of a church in southeastern Minnesota, and then was called to pastor a church in Brooklyn. And most of my memories are of family and church, because that's my life revolved around that. I was one of 5 children, the 4th of 5 children. And I guess you'd say, even in terms of family, our lives revolved around the things of the Lord. We talked about God a lot. Even when we were talking about other things, that there was always that element in our lives. And it was interesting because both with my dad and my Uncle Clifford, who was a minister, became a missionary, you always kind of sensed with them that there was a silent conversation going on between them and the Lord. Because we would be driving somewhere in the car, and nobody's talking, and then one of them would say, "Thank you, Jesus." And obviously something had come to them that made them want to be thankful to the Lord. So that was the atmosphere in which we grew up. I learned to read at the age of 4, and became a voracious reader very quickly. And the book, of course, that my dad read a lot was the Bible. So I became interested in reading the Bible. And I don't know when I started reading the Bible, but it was pretty early. And because of that, I became knowledgeable about the Bible. Not probably in a deep theological sense, but in the sense that I knew a lot of names and what was going on in the Bible. And my family used to play something we called the Bible game when we would travel. And the way it worked was you'd say, "I'm thinking of a Bible character whose name begins with, let's say, A." And the person couldn't just say, "Is it Abraham?" They would have to say, "Is it the husband of Sarah?" Well, the idea was that you wanted to become more and more obscure with the one you were thinking of, you know. And my dad was the best at it, and I, at quite a young age, became the second best. Part of it had to do with the fact that I was a word person from very, very early on, a very early reader, more so than my siblings. And part of it had to do with the fact that I just was more and more and more familiar with the Bible. It just became part of me from a very early age. And we had some fairly long trips. So that became a part of what we did. Living in Brooklyn was it was a wonderful place to live, absolutely wonderful place to live. The first place we lived that I remember best, we lived on the second floor. It was a rental situation. We lived on the second floor of a house. Our landlady, Mrs. Coppola, may have been Coppola, but we called her Coppola, lived on the first floor. And I guess she may have had some family. We lived on the second floor. It seems to me now that it must have been an awfully small apartment for a family of six. Later on it was 7 because my younger brother was born. But we lived there, and I did go out and I played outside. And in the street we played stickball, which is baseball with a broomstick. And if we didn't have a stick, it was punch ball. And a manhole would be home base, and another manhole would be third base, and the sewer grates would be first and third. Another manhole would be second base. So we played that a lot, and we had some other games we played, caught, ring-o-levio, and things like that. I don't remember too much about how those games were played, but the main activity was to play stickball or punch ball. So I had some friends in the neighborhood, no close friends, except for one girl who was slightly older than me, and her family was from our church. They lived a couple of blocks away, and she became my friend. And I tended to be, I was not foolhardy, but I tended to do some foolish things at times. And her family had a garage. They had their own house, and they had a garage, and I jumped off the garage one day, just because I thought that would be a fun thing to do. And it was fun until I hit the ground, and I wasn't seriously hurt, but I kind of came together like that, you know. So my chin hit my knee, and it was kind of a little bit of a shock to my mouth. But there was another time that potentially could have been quite serious, and I actually think I may have suffered from that fall for my entire life. We had a playground. I think it was just a couple of blocks from my house, and we used to go there and play during the summer. In the winter, there was what we called a seesaw. Some people call it a teeter-totter, right? Yeah. So we would use that. We would use the swings, and there were slides. The slide itself was made out of wood, and so to protect it from the elements in the winter, they would remove the slide part of it, and all that stood was the framework with the steps. Okay. And so this would have been late fall, fairly cold weather. I was by myself. I went over to the playground. And, you know, there wasn't much I could do with the seesaw. Oh, we had monkey bars, too, as we called them, jungle gym. There wasn't much I could do with a seesaw, or wasn't interested in the swings, but I thought that this slide presented an interesting sort of challenge to me, and that was to climb up the steps backward, rather than going up the regular way. I was going to go up like this, which worked very well, except at the top, the way the railing went, it went around in a circle, kind of like this, you know? And so I came to the top, and I was going to grab onto those bars, but I missed. So I fell from the top. I don't know how big it is. I don't know how tall a slide would be, but I fell backward on my head, on the asphalt, concrete, whatever it was. And I was knocked out. I don't know for how long. And, you know, I don't remember. I suppose I had a bump on my head. I never told my parents about it. I know I had a headache, and I walked home. I would have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 when I did that. I do know this, and I know that this is a rare thing because doctors are always surprised when they hear it. I know that from the time I was quite a young boy, I had headaches. And I mean frequent headaches. And it's not out of the question that it might have been a result of that stupid fall.
Yeah, definitely.
I didn't fracture anything. I mean, there's nothing you could see in my head, and my brain developed rather well. But that was a dumb thing to do, I think, yeah. But I had a lot of fun outside. But really, primarily, I was a bookworm. I read a lot, and one of the things I remember, we had a set of encyclopedias. They were not quite as large as encyclopedias became, but they were small volumes. Funk and Wagnalls was the name of the publisher, Funk and Wagnalls Encyclopedias. And there was a bookshelf full of them. Well, you know, I was a reader and I wanted to read anything I could. We didn't have an enormous number of books in our home, and at that point I was too young to go to the library. So I decided to read the encyclopedias, and I read the encyclopedia from beginning to end. And to this day, I know that my head is full of a lot of what was thought, at least at that time, to be information, and probably is now long since defunct, no longer valid, but there it is. So I know things about the world, some of which is probably true because it's, you know, geography and stuff like that. Not names of places so much, because a lot of those have changed. But yeah, that was something that I read. I read the encyclopedia from end to end. And yeah, that was my main activity. My older brother and I have to tell you this, my older brother, who was 6 years older than I, his name is Harmon, was the best brother you could possibly imagine. Because from a very, very early age, he involved me in everything. He was my friend. And even though he had friends of his own age, he really was a wonderful brother and treated me with such respect. And I mean, obviously I would say he loved me, but you know, we didn't think of those terms necessarily, but he was so great. One of the things that we played at home, we had little soldiers made, I think they were probably made of lead, because they were pretty sturdy, but they were only about this big. And so we would play some kind of a game of war. And each of us had a line of these soldiers, probably about 10 of them lined up like this. And the way we would play it is you'd roll a marble and try to hit the other guy's soldiers. And if you hit one, he was wounded, but if you knocked him down, he was dead. And so then, if one of your soldiers was dead, you had to remove him and put him in the dead pile. And my brother had quite a sense of humor. I think we all had a lot of humor in our lives. My dad had a great sense of humor. And so I remember one day we were playing this marble war game, and I shot my marble and it went into his pile of dead soldiers. And he said, "Oh, now they're seriously dead." You know, you think about seriously wounded, well, these guys were seriously dead. A lot of silly things like that. We lived there until I was about 10, I think. And then we moved to another place. That was owned by the church, I think, the building we moved into. And it was a wonderful brownstone. It was wonderful for a couple of reasons. They owned the lot next to it, which had a garage at the back of it. It was a driveway, but it was a full lot size. So there's a room to play and do various things in there, even though it's all concrete. We had a backyard. There were 3 levels, At one time, they would have called it the first floor, but it was one level up, and that would have been the main living level for the family, and then the next floor up would have been the bedrooms, and the downstairs would have been the servants' quarters. But things were changed. Our main living level was the basement, because that had always been where the kitchen was, because the servants were the ones who had done the cooking. But we lived down there. We had our living room, dining room, kitchen down there. The second floor was our bedrooms, and the top floor was what we called the Missionary Rooms, because we often had people traveling in and out who had come home from the mission field on furlough or were on their way, and they would stay up there. And before we'd been there too long, there was a woman who had spent many years in Asia and really had gone through some rough things. She was Norwegian, spoke with a strong Norwegian accent, but she became the sort of the housekeeper up there. So she was a permanent resident. She lived up there. But we lived in this building, and it was really a great building because the rooms were big. There was really more room for all of us. It was a great place to live. All of the time up to then, I walked to school, and by that time I really didn't have friends in the neighborhood. There probably weren't too many kids in that neighborhood when I think about it. I didn't have friends in the neighborhood, and I had become so much of a bookworm that I would read going to school, and I'd bump into the lampposts and things like that, you know. And we were much closer to our church, so it was possible to walk to church from where we were. School wasn't very far away either. The way things were in those days, we were just around, well, a few, let's see, it would have been one building beyond that driveway was really, I think it was at the end of it was a storefront, and that street up there, Fifth Avenue, was stores. So my mother would go shopping almost every day. We didn't have freezers and things like that. She'd go shopping every day. And you didn't go to just one store. There was no such thing as a supermarket. So there was the meat market, the butchers, as we called it. There was the fruit and vegetable store. And then there was a store that was a little bit like a supermarket, but it was all dried food, canned food and dried food. So she would go shopping often, and that's where she would go, and she had to go all these different stores. There was one place we called the deli, and it was a delicatessen. That's where you would buy cold cuts and cheese and that kind of thing. So that was our neighborhood, and there was a streetcar, as we call it. Some people call it a trolley, that ran along that. A lot of kids would jump on the back of the trolley and take rides here and there. I never did that. While we were living there, I got a bike, a 3-speed bike, which was really a treasure for me. And sometimes, especially in the summer, when it would get cool in the evening, I would take my bike and I would ride for miles around Brooklyn. The other thing that I would do a lot, the church was made up largely of immigrants from Norway, and then their children and their children. But it was very Norwegian. In fact, when we moved there, the morning service on Sunday was in Norwegian. But very quickly after we came there, it was changed to English. But they continued to have a Norwegian service on Wednesday evening, but it was very Norwegian. And we would have guest preachers come from Norway, from Philadelphia Church in Oslo, and my dad would interpret for them. And I'll tell you, I never had to be dragged to church. I love to go to church. I sit by my mother, but I love to go to church, and heard the most wonderful preaching. My dad was a wonderful preacher too, but these guys were such great preachers, and I love to listen to them. I say that's a little bit of background for one of the things that I did. I was free to go on the subway anywhere in the city. My parents didn't worry about me. It wasn't dangerous. And one of the things I did once or twice was serve as the guide for one of these preachers and take him all around the city on the subway, which is a really cool thing to be able to do. But also, I was so blessed by this. There was a woman in the church, Ingrid Matson. Her husband had left her. They were not divorced, but he had left her and gone back to Norway. And she had 2 sons, one of whom was exactly my age and one of whom was a year older. Now, she worked all week, worked long hours all week, but she devoted her Saturdays to her boys. And she always took them someplace in the city every Saturday. And I got invited to go along. So I had the most wonderful experiences. We went up to Bronx Zoo. Now, the zoo in the Bronx is one of the greatest zoos in the United States. So we would go up there, long subway and elevated ride up there, but we would spend the day up there. And I don't know what she did. I mean, she just was there, and we did all the stuff. We saw all the animals, and we ran around, and we went many times to the American Museum of Natural History, which is one of the great museums in the United States. And in addition to all the exhibits, they had a film every Saturday, about various aspects of science, history, and various things like that. And so we did all of those things. And then in addition to that, when they were home, I was often invited to their home and got to play with them. We played Monopoly and that sort of board games and things like that. Sometimes there were 1 or 2 other boys who were involved, but it was mostly me and Walter and Stanley. They were very, very close friends of mine, and we really enjoyed being together. So that was my circle of friends, was those boys. And as I got a little bit older, we had a group of kids who were girls and boys. And we began to be interested in the girls, as girls. I was 13 when I left there, but before I was 13, I was very interested in some of these girls. And we became a group of kids who were sort of varying romantic relationships from time to time among them. And we got to do some things as a group. One of the nice things was that the church, we had picnics, a number of picnics every year, and we would go quite a long way away to a large park where we would have these picnics. And the kids got to do a lot of stuff, just running around and playing and that sort of thing. So we had many opportunities to be together as a group. The most important thing is that in 1951, when I was 12 years old, I had grown up in the church. I loved the church. I loved the Bible. And I had been confronted all along with this fact, but in 1951, I think it was March of 1951, we had a visiting preacher, and on a Sunday night, I faced the fact for myself that I did not have a personal relationship with Jesus, even though I had gone through all this stuff all the time. And I thought, I got to settle this now. It was a Sunday evening. Our Sunday evening meeting started at 7:30. We didn't have TV, you understand. We didn't have all the wonderful things that people do instead of going to church. So it started at 7:30, and it would last probably an hour and a half, and then at the end, a lot of people would go to the prayer room, which was in the basement of the church. And often, it was a pretty good sized room, but often it would overflow into other parts of the basement. A lot of people were at prayer, kneeling in prayer. So that evening, this man preached. I don't have any idea what he preached about, because that wasn't important. What was important was that I was being convicted by the Holy Spirit and faced with my own need for personal salvation. And so I remember very well exactly the place, the corner in that prayer room where I knelt. And it was a very simple thing. I just said yes to the Lord, and that I was going to live for the Lord. It was simple in that moment, but the feeling was so radical. I walked home from church alone, which is not uncommon, and I felt like Well, we used to have shows on the radio, adventure shows, family shows, all that. And Superman was one of them. And they used to say about Superman that he could leap tall buildings at a single bound. I felt like that. I felt so liberated, so strong, so powerful, so excited. And it was really hard to understand, hard to explain. But I just had this tremendous feeling of freedom. And it wasn't that I had been a bad kid before, but it's just that there was this new thing in my life. And there are a number of others my age, I think, who were going through similar experiences at that time. And I think it was in September of the year, we had water baptism services. And in our church, the way it worked was, if you wanted to become a member of the church, you would be baptized in water. The two things were very closely connected. And so, in a sense, you would apply for church membership. And so, of course, I talked to my dad about becoming a member. And we had what were called assembly meetings, which is a meeting of the membership of the church. And your name would be brought before an assembly meeting. And I mean, this would be maybe 150 people would meet for assembly meetings. And an interesting thing happened. I think it was that same year. That summer, I think it was. Every couple of years we had gone to Minnesota for a family reunion. But in 1951, we took a much longer trip, a 6 weeks trip, my whole family. We drove down into the South and went across the South to California, where my dad had preaching. He was invited to preach there for like 3 weeks or something like that, and then went up to and just before that, I had become a close friend of another Stanley in the church, and he and I both fairly strong personalities, and we had some arguments, and it reached a point where there was a lot of heat between us at one point, and we kind of broke off our relationship, and we were very angry. And I was feeling very bad about it. And during that summer, while we were away, I wrote him a letter asking for forgiveness. And so when my name came up before the assembly meeting, people would speak for or against, if they wanted to, somebody become a member. And his father got up to testify on my behalf, to say, this is what Lynell did. And my mother and father had known nothing about this. They didn't know I had done this. So it was kind of a good feeling for them to know that I'd done this. So yes, I was accepted and was baptized in water in September of 1951, and along with a few of my friends. So then I was a member of the church. So that's the local stuff. I should mention that every couple of years we would go to Minnesota. My dad had 7 living siblings. Actually, there were 12 who were born into the family, but 4 of them died very young, as really young children, and but 8 survived. And most of them would gather in Minnesota. A number of them, probably the majority, were still living in northern Minnesota, which was where the family came from. And we would gather for a reunion. And I remember one in particular where they had, I don't know what they did, somehow put stuff together to create a table that was enormously long outside. It was on a farm, and it was outside. And it was sort of, if you can imagine this, I'm sure you've seen things like this on television. You know, the chickens and huge bowls of vegetables and potatoes and just this whole long thing. And we would gather around that table and eat. And I had a bunch of cousins, and we would be together and have a wonderful time together. And there are a few cousins of my age. And the town, that was kind of out of town, but the town was Thief River Falls, and we would be there. Usually we stayed at my grandma's house, and so we would be there at night, and we would go swimming in the river. And the thing I remember most about that was the mosquitoes. There were so many mosquitoes that you tried to keep your head underwater. Even it wasn't very deep, so we didn't really swim, but you tried to keep your head underwater as much as possible to here, so that you wouldn't get bitten by these mosquitoes. It was horrible. They were just clouds of mosquitoes. But of course, you had to go in the water anyway. But we had a lot of fun together as siblings. But the other thing about that I remember so much is my dad and his brothers. I remember being in Grandma's house and being upstairs in an attic, sort of, which is where I was sleeping. And my dad and his brothers sitting around the table downstairs. And I would go to the top of the stairs to listen to them. And it wasn't what they were saying as much as the good time they were having. These guys laughed so hard together, you know? And it was just such a great feeling to hear men, siblings, having such a great time together. It was really a high point, kind of, for me, of the reunion, to hear these men having such a great time. My dad was not, didn't express a lot of emotion, generally, outwardly. And I will tell you that in my family, there wasn't a lot of, what can I say, love expressed outwardly. I remember when I was very, very little, being picked up by my mother or father, sitting in their lap, and I think the word that they used was lover. They would say to me, lover, come and sit in my, but after that, there was no hugging and kissing. I didn't see my mother and father hug and kiss. When he would come home from a trip, there would be a peck on the lips, and that was it. And no hugging in our family, ever. No I love yous in our family, ever. Just didn't happen. And interestingly enough, that stuck with my older siblings. And they never were able to hug. And my brother just died a year ago. My older sister, both of them, now my oldest sister died, oh, wow, in the 1990s something. But it was true of all of them. They couldn't hug. When we would get together, they couldn't hug me. I hugged them, and they would stand like this. They just couldn't do it. But when I was 10 years old, I remember going to bed, and it wasn't that my dad had been angry or anything, but I went to bed and I thought, when I grow up, I'm going to be a different kind of dad. Not that I thought he was a bad person, but I thought, I'm going to show my kids how much I love them. And I don't know what gave me that idea. It just was, I guess I probably had seen something of more outward emotion expressed in some other families or something. And I was determined, I'm going to show my kids that I love them. And I was fortunate enough when I got together with Judy, my first wife. I came into a family of people who were exactly the opposite. They would practically kiss each other goodbye when they went to the grocery store a block away, you know. They were extremely affectionate. And that made it easy for me. And, you know, I mean, my affection toward my kids is so strong, and it was with my boys as well as my girls. You know, it's always giving them a hug, kissing them, telling them I love you. There was no wall. There was no barrier to that at all. But I'm the only one. Somehow it didn't affect any of the other kids that way. Yeah, just something need to happen.
No, it just probably means we're at a battery on this one, which is usually what happens.
That's
Okay.
not a problem. We can just, this one's still working, so it's
Okay.
not a problem. Yeah.
And in that connection, I'll just mention this. In that specific connection, years later, when we were in Chicago, that's another part of the story, but we were in Chicago. My parents had been living in Chicago, and they had moved back to Brooklyn. And I was, it was just a few months, actually, after they had moved to Brooklyn. And so it was just maybe 4 months since I had seen them. And there was a convention of ministers somewhere in the Midwest. And my dad decided to come to that convention. And I rode with one of the pastors in Chicago to that convention. And I got out of the car and I saw my dad about 2 blocks away. And I had this great feeling of love that just sprang up in me for my dad. And I didn't run, but I went to him and I threw my arms around him and he responded that way. And that was one of the few times that ever happened. Anyway, what happened was when I was 13, one thing I maybe should tell you is that I had skipped half a grade because when I first started in school, they had this system of half years where you could enter either in January or in June. And because I had entered in January, they didn't change the system when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. So you had if you had a January entry, you either had to go ahead half a year or go back half a year. They put me ahead half a year. And so then in 6th grade, I was, instead of they had 2 systems. You could go to a school that went through 8th grade, or you could go to a junior high school. And it was recommended that I go to a junior high school and that I go into an accelerated program, so that you would you would cover 7, 8, and 9 in 2 years. So that's where I went. At the end of that, the junior high experience, my dad resigned from the church in Brooklyn and felt that we were going to go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was going to start a church there. And to me, in the King James Version, it describes Moses, after Moses had to flee Egypt because he killed somebody. He fled, and in the King James Version it says he was on the backside of the desert. Well, to me, that's what Albuquerque was. It was the backside of the desert. Not the geographic thing, although it was that. I mean, there was no city there, and I had grown in love with New York, especially Brooklyn. But I go to school, and I literally knew more about every subject than the teacher did. And so that wasn't too much fun. But everything was just so, I mean, it's terrible to talk about it. I sound like such a snob, but everything was so backward. It was just so backward. I hated living there. To make it worse, we started going to this church. My dad was beginning to make connections and thinking about what he's going to do about starting a church. And we hadn't been there more than a month or so when the pastor of the church where he had been ordained up in Minnesota was asked to go to Liberia to teach for, 3 months or something like that. And they asked my dad to fill the pulpit during that time. Duluth, Minnesota. So he goes up to Duluth, and we're stuck in Albuquerque. My mother didn't drive. We didn't have a car because my dad took the car. But it wouldn't matter because my mother didn't drive. And we'd been going to a pretty good-sized church, Assemblies of God church, downtown, and now we were stuck out on the western peninsula of Albuquerque. Now, people in the church down there offered to give us a ride, but this is what happens. We have a family meeting. And there was a little Assemblies of God church just 2 blocks away from where we were living, way out there on the western peninsula. And she said, Western Mesa, I mean. And my mother said, now kids, I know that we could go to that church downtown. I know that folks have offered us a ride to go to the church downtown, but don't you think that this little church over here really needs us? Of course, we know that, Mother. So we ended up going to this little church. And the young people's group, I was 13. The young people's group comprised me, my older sister Maxine, who was 4 years older, and a girl named Susie, who was the daughter of the pastor, who was my age or maybe a year older. That was the young people's group. And well, again, the preaching was very much like being in the deep South, in the sense that almost like hillbilly South, in that very uneducated preachers. They were good, wonderful people, you know, but it was. And then the other thing that happened was they were so short of Sunday school teachers. So they asked me to teach Sunday school. I'm 13 years old. And I'm teaching kids who were probably 3 years younger than I was. But you know, looking back, of course, I can see that was very good for me. It was very good for me because that was really the beginning of ministry for me. At the time, it seemed very strange. I enjoyed doing it, though. I mean, anyway, but it was just a few months, because at the end of that school year, what happened while my dad was in Duluth, there was a convention in a church in Chicago, and my dad went to the convention, and they were looking for a pastor, and he preached down there, and they called him to be a pastor. So at the end of the school year, we moved up to Chicago, and that began the years in Chicago. So we drove up there, and he became the pastor of that church in Chicago, and was there for 10 years. And that's where I met Judy and her family. Wonderful, wonderful people, lovely church. Our song leader was an old man who was his hearing was going. So, and the way it worked was that the song leader really led the song with his voice, but he would tend to go flat. And our piano player was very sensitive to this. So by the second or third verse of the song, she would transpose down a key so that she would accommodate his singing. But after 2 years, something like that, he died. And my dad asked if I would become the song leader. So I became the song leader. And another thing was that, again, my dad had so much respect for me. It's just amazing. Two times a month, we would go down to a mission on what they called Skid Row, where a lot of men were mostly alcoholics, probably some drug addicts, mostly alcoholics, who would stay in flop houses, as they were called. We call them shelters now, but it would be a nightly thing, and you go and try to find a place to sleep. These guys were homeless, but they would come to these missions because if you stayed through a meeting, you would get a meal. That's the way it worked. So, but the way it worked was the people who ran these missions really just administered the mission, but somebody else came in for the service. So we were responsible for in this particular mission to come twice a month on a Tuesday and a Friday. And so my dad would preach, and a bunch of us young people and others would go down and be part of it, and we would sing. And the idea was this congregational singing, but we were up on the platform and we did most of the singing, and it was a good experience. But by the time I was, I think, 16, there came a time when my dad was not available to go, and he asked me if I would preach. Absolutely amazing. So that was my first preaching, and it was a very wonderful thing in terms of learning to preach, because I learned to be brief, and I learned how to present a clear gospel message. It had to be clear because these guys weren't very clear. And it also was wonderful because some guys always came forward. I'm not sure they always understood what was going on, but they always felt a need for something, you know. And so I did that a few times. And you probably know that we were married, Judy and I were married when I was 18 and she was 16. And by that time, you know, we were heavily involved in ministry, and when I was 19 and she was 17, we were asked by a church in Minnesota to come and be involved with a mission work on an Indian reservation. They had one meeting a month, one meeting a week on Wednesday nights. So we would go to the church that called us up there on Sundays, and then on Wednesday nights we would go out and conduct this meeting. We were out there other times too, but for the meeting we were there on Wednesday nights. This was a Chippewa reservation, and the most wonderful people in the world. Not a big congregation, but wonderful, wonderful people. So that was my real introduction to preaching on a regular basis. And I'll be very frank, a lot of the people in the church didn't think too much of these folks out on the reservation. And the folks on the reservation knew that very well. And probably the best thing about us, for these people on the reservation, was that they knew that we loved them. Megan was born during that time. And, you know, and she was born on a Wednesday night. The next Wednesday night, she was with us at Sawyer, the reservation. And the Indian ladies unwrapped her, you know. The first thing we heard was, "She's so white." But you know, they loved that little girl. They just loved that little girl. And we had such a wonderful relationship with those folks. And the other thing was funny about this, we're living in northern Minnesota. In the winter it got to be 35 below or something. We saw the northern lights. A lot of wonderful things up there. But a lot of the people in the church, they didn't want to take their kids out in this cold weather. So they would keep their kids at home. We took Megan out all the time. We took your mom out all the time, bundled up. She was the healthiest kid in the church. But unfortunately, I had to work because they didn't really pay us to do this. They gave us gas money, so I had to get a job. And the jobs primarily were in the paper mill, which is the worst work imaginable, because and the guys who worked there on the long term, they all got sick because of the inhaling Fortunately, I didn't have to work in paper mill, because soon after we came there, I went to the local newspaper, which is a daily newspaper, a weekly newspaper, and I talked to the editor, and by God's grace, he hired me to work there. And basically what I did was I rewrote press releases as they came in. But after I'd been there a couple of weeks, I got to do a little reporting. And the first time I saw somebody on the street reading something that I had written, this is another epiphany for me. I thought, oh man, this is what I have to do. This is what I have to do. And it only lasted a few months because what really happened was, I mean, after just a few weeks there, he went hunting. So he was away and I was in charge. 19 years old, never done this kind of work before. I'm in charge. The press room was right next to the office. And in those days, these were metal plates. These guys had a line-type machine, and the presses were running right behind. And the Monday I came in, this older man who's been there forever comes out to me and says, "What's the headline for today?" I mean, I was in charge. But it didn't last very long because once the Christmas advertising rush was over, they really didn't have enough revenue to continue paying me. So soon after that, I didn't have a job and we just had to leave. So we went back to Chicago. And during the next year, I went to work for an insurance company in their office, which I had done before. But for a year, I answered every ad for any kind of editorial work in the Chicago Tribune. Didn't matter if they wanted a senior editor or if they wanted a beginner. I didn't care. I just answered every single one. I thought, sometime this is going to work. And after a year, I did get an editorial job, and that's how I got started in that business. And the rest is history, in a sense, you know.